Thank you. All right. Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, the 24th. This is the SIG Testing Weekly Meeting. I'm Aaron Krickenberger. You are all being publicly recorded and will be posted to YouTube very shortly. So say we all. I don't have a ton on the agenda today, but a couple things to ramble on about, the very first of which I will share my screen for, if I can. There you all are. Okay. So V19 stuff. How is our milestone looking? I have been going through our roadmap doc, which helpfully I did not link in the meeting notes, but I will dig up and link when I can. And I've tried to add all of the issues from that to the 1.9 milestone here. So I think it was Ben this morning who very helpfully, like when somebody comes and asks, like, what are we working on? What's our plan for the next release? This is it. This is all the stuff we want help with. Generally speaking, if somebody's assigned to it, that's the person who's supposedly working on it. And I just wanted to see if we as a group agreed that roughly speaking everything in here belongs in here. And if we were cool with periodically revisiting this at the beginning of every SIG testing meeting or some interval, just to make sure like what's in here still belongs in here and makes sense as we drive towards release. The high-level goals that I tried to get in here are any issue that related to deprecating Jenkins, any issue that involved migrating Jenkins jobs, and any issue that involved Tide and making Prow better. Issues around replacing the submit queue, issues around migrating mungers to different plugins. Something I still have yet to do here, if it's of help at all, is while we have this table and we've kind of described what we're roughly planning to do for most of them, we don't necessarily have issues that correspond to all of them that we could cross off. But I'm getting a better sense of where we're at today, but that's also because I've had my head in this game pretty consistently for the past couple of days. The real goal here is for somebody to be able to come, somebody, maybe myself, who might get distracted by steering committee stuff and yanked around in other places, to be able to come back here and figure out, like, are we still doing the stuff we said we did? If we had really awesome ideas in the meantime and went ahead and just did them, are we doing that in a way where we're getting the right level of visibility so we can communicate best practices and also getting the chance to brag about all the awesome stuff we're doing? So any miscellaneous comments on that? Okay. I had, in sort of a more concrete thing there, I was at the SIG release 1.9 team meeting this morning with Ben, where we got to introduce ourselves to everybody. And Anthony, the release manager, showed this as the release timeline. So the things that are relevant and pertinent to this group are Thursday, November 16th is in theory when we're supposed to start setting up CI around the release 1.9 branch. I think that's pretty uncontroversial. He calls out down here November 29th is when we begin manual downgrade testing. So I was wondering if that means we ought to go ahead and set up automated upgrade testing, automated downgrade testing, if there's any manual upgrade testing, find out about that. But I think generally it was a pretty easy copy-paste job for Sen. My other question around this is looking at this code slush and code freeze on November 20th and November 22nd. What do those even mean? Well, they mean something like this, where it's like only pull requests that are approved for the milestone, and then like, what does that even mean? Because there's all this discussion around labels and things of that nature. Basically, when I say what does that even mean, the question I'm trying to ask is, find this. The question I'm trying to ask is, can these problems be discussed in, can code slush and code freeze be articulated in terms of GitHub label queries? Because this is how Tide works. And I'm trying to understand if SIG testing, do we feel comfortable enough with Tide? Do we want to try rolling it out onto KK before code slush and code freeze? And do we feel that it is capable of accomplishing whatever the heck code slush and code freeze mean? based on this and discussion in SIG release, it sounds like, yeah, we can. If it's just label queries like milestone v19 and label status approved, label LGTM, label CNCF yes, whatever all the other labels are for like passing tests. I think we can. But I wanted to defer to the experts on that and just generally get a sense of where we feel like we're at on the roadmap of rolling Tide out.
There's a couple things that still need to be done, notably the front end, and currently Tide considers all the jobs that are available as statuses as required, which is not true for Kubernetes. So those two things need to be resolved before we're able to roll it out everywhere.
Okay. That feels, I don't know about the web UI, but that feels like something we can accomplish within the next week or two. And that still gives us about 2 or 3 weeks before code freeze where we decide whether or not we want to go with it for reals. My only ask is if it's something we want to go with for reals, we have the opportunity to, what's a better word than socialize? I don't know, demo it to the release team, if the release team is comfortable with it so that everybody's on the same page with where do I go to check the status of things? How does this all work? Do I know what all the right labels are? A lot of this is a mess of labels of the release team's own making, but when it comes to do I know if the submit queue, whoops, it's not the submit queue anymore, it's Tide, just so long as they know what the thing is, what it looks like when it's working correctly, all that stuff.
Ideally, they don't have to know. I mean, their interface will be largely the same, and the implementation
totally.
I mean, shouldn't have to care.
It should just work. I love the word should. I could see the number one thing that might come up as a point of confusion if we're in the thick of things is how could we make sure that Tide only merges just this one pull request, because we want just this one pull request and we want to exclude everything else. So I'll try and help brainstorm with the release team as we sort of move forward what those tricky use cases might be. But these are the sorts of things that often make people clamor for ordering in a queue, which, as I understand it, Tide doesn't understand the concept of order. I think it's just a query. I mean, is there some sort of sort in the query that it uses, like most recently updated or something like that?
I'm not sure. I can check that real quick, but I believe it's mainly based on the idea that all the PRs are in a pool, so they're all given equal chance.
That doesn't make sense. I mean, maybe in the general case, but I mean, what if you have something that's breaking and you need to merge the unbreaking before all the other things? That just seems like a very common case for a submit queue.
But they run the whole pool at once, though.
So you'd merge the single one that passed, and the rest would just waste some cycles, but otherwise it wouldn't cause any trouble. Okay.
But yeah, that's Marty's question was exactly the thing, right? I would anticipate we want to have a good, well understood story for that.
I mean, I think it makes sense. It's if the PR is actually LGTM approved and if all the tests are passing, it goes in, and we just try to do that as fast as possible.
So there is a little bit of sorting. It looks like it prioritizes the lower PR numbers, so older PRs go in first, but that's it.
I mean, don't get me wrong, it sounds like, I mean, the implication would be if you had some sort of breakage and you had this PR that fixed it, it would be the only one whose test passed, and it would be the only one that would actually go into the queue. I guess I would share Aaron's concern around people's expectations. If they expect to be able to do things like prioritize or whatever, there has to be some communication about how the new regime will work, so they don't have an expectation that's violated and then they're annoyed and unhappy. And pointlessly, right?
Yep.
Where's that in mind? UI, and we need to fix up a few places where we refer to the submit queue now. We need to have that planned. Like, Kubernetes README has a link to this submit queue and a badge. Things like that. We'll want to like update it all, so everyone knows what's going on.
Yeah, and whatever, dude. There are documents upon documents, some of which are right, some of which aren't right, but they all still mention things anyway. It's good luck finding the 9 different pages that mention our pull request process. Okay. Speaking of documentation, I just one of the things I scraped into the 1.9 roadmap was better documentation for our Prow plugins. Since we talk about how awesome Prow is, that's cool, but what are all these plugins and what do they even do? Sometimes the names are self-explanatory. Sometimes you get to derive that by looking at the commands.md file, and you can sort of see different slashes. But I think we're gradually evolving towards needing to have a little more structure around it. I had an issue somewhere in the 1.9 milestone that I pulled in that was talking about how do we improve this, because I'm happy to do the lowest phi thing, which is just create a readme.md in the plugins directory, add a 1-line entry for every plugin, and boom, that's how we do it going forward. If you add a new plugin, you add it to that. I'm wondering if this begins to change now that we support, or we're planning on supporting, out-of-tree plugins. I've also heard mention of potentially having Prow provide a URI that you can hit to just automatically get help for all of the things that it currently supports or implements. So
that's something I was planning on working on within the next week or two. I was going to add a /help endpoint to Prow's deck that serves up all the plugin help information.
So see, that sounds like a way better thing to do, and maybe I shouldn't waste time on a read.
When you do that, can we register the help with the plugins so you can have a per repo one that knows the plugins that are applied to the repo and doesn't show you the help for the plugins you don't have?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. That's what I was intending to do. I'm not exactly sure on how it's going to end up looking because plugins can register for an arbitrary number of events. So I'll have to figure out the details on that. But yeah, that's the idea.
Well, don't we have a config that says like the repo is set for this plugin?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
All right. Well, I'll work with you offline. I still feel like it would be useful to have documentation about what the potential set of plugins could be, not necessarily the ones that are live, but that definitely sounds like the much more automation-friendly thing. One thing I really love about the submit queue today is when anybody asks, like, what do I have to do to get my PR merged? I can literally link them to the thing that says merge requirements, and it is dynamically updated depending upon how the submit queue is configured. So as those label requirements and whatnot change, from code slush to code freeze to just status quo, so too does the documentation. It's glorious. Okay, I think at this point, unless there's any other 1.9 related stuff that we want to talk about, I will hand over to Eric for Prow and Bootstrap integration.
I have one thing. You mentioned when you were talking about the milestone, the Jenkins related issues.
Yeah.
Are we planning to actually make a policy that I saw Eric has an issue that says something like in centralized support for Jenkins. But today we had a couple of PRs asking to add new Jenkins jobs.
We should not do that.
Okay.
I mean, I was sort of under the impression that this team is the team that gets to say no more Jenkins, and that if you, in return, if you really need a new job, we get to help you migrate your job to Prow. So this discussion comes up sometimes when somebody wants to run Docker as part of their job, and they say that's a feature that Prow doesn't have that we really, really, really need to support. We ought to be moving those discussions into issues so we can identify if there are truly concrete use cases that Prow does not yet support and we must implement before we can turn down Jenkins, or if there's some other way they could accomplish what they need to within the existing constraints of Prow. But that we ought to be helpful in whittling down, really like to make sure we're not accepting new jobs and really hopefully whittling down the existing set of jobs. So the way I stated it at the community meeting was no more Jenkins in 1.9, but I think that the realistic thing is we actually turn it off or power it down in the new year, but really we're not supporting it after.
If we want to actually follow through on no new ones. So it is going to take some effort to migrate existing jobs that might be useful. But if we had new ones, then we're just adding more things we have to migrate.
Yeah, no new ones would be. I would certainly.
One thing to keep in mind is we technically have two Jenkinses. We have a pull request Jenkins and a, I guess, CI or post submit Jenkins. And I would say ideally, no new Jenkins jobs. I would say that the more important thing would be no new pull request Jenkins jobs.
And that's what these are.
Right. So I think if someone wants a blocking pull request job, they need to figure out we should make sure it runs on Prow so that we don't have to figure that out later.
Why is Docker and Docker not a good solution?
That's a perfectly fine solution.
Oh, okay.
It's just as long as it can be a regular container that doesn't have access to the host's Docker, then that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, what happens inside the container, we don't care.
I mean, it does imply that the container has to have escalated privileges.
Yeah, the Bazel jobs, since Bazel also creates containers, it also has escalated privileges. So that's fine as long as it's not, we just want Kubernetes to be managing the containers on the node. And we don't want to deal with weird, zombie things that yeah.
So, I mean, the implication is if you want to create a new Jenkins job and the reason you want to do it is because you're using Docker, do we have an image that you can use with Prow that has Docker and Docker that they could target instead?
We don't yet. There'd been when I brought up the idea, a few people had very much disliked the concept of using Docker and Docker.
That's what I was trying to get at, because I heard the same thing. And for me, I think it's a necessary evil. Certainly for things like the verify scripts that are launching, containers willy-nilly, that's not a good reason to use Docker and Docker. But Quentin Lee's, desire to get E2E jobs running against a Docker and Docker cluster, that seems to me a perfectly legitimate reason to use it. So,
not to go much farther, but if anyone has a clean way to make it part of one, like our E2E image, I would be very happy to push for that pull request. I tried using a sidecar container, and that has kind of some issues with how Prow expects cleanup to work. It expects your container to actually exit.
Let's talk offline. I've built Docker and Docker images for quite a while. There's some gotchas around getting that to work cleanly, and maybe I can help.
Awesome.
And one last thing to Eric's point, you reminded me something I said, but do not have in time for today, is to work with Jace around documenting criteria to consider a job as blocking either the release or blocking merges. And I would say it's a fair thing to say, in order for it to be a pre-submit PR blocking job, it has to be a Prow job. I need to actually go back and confirm that all of our pre-submit jobs are in fact Prow jobs.
I'm pretty sure most of them are not actually right now.
There are a few like the verified job that are going to need something like Docker and Docker or total rewrite.
Do the EDE jobs use?
They're migrating towards not. They're using Bazel. A few of them do their own builds, like I think Federation and
Federation is
are
not blocking. Yeah, I think
Federation will shortly be totally different. So.
And I think COPS. I have master working on COPS, but not 1.7 for whatever reason.
We got the GC/etc3.1 off, which was I think the main blocking E2E that was still on Jenkins. It's on Jenkins for 1.6.
Right. Yeah, I remember that. Okay, so maybe not such a hard and fast requirement now, but certainly, again, back to the no new jobs. Okay, and for really reals, even if there are other things I wanted to talk about, I'm not going to. Eric, you want to take it away on Bootstrap?
So I shared out a doc yesterday which is in the meeting notes about right now, our images put Bootstrap, which is responsible for copying up logs and telling Kubernetes and TestGrid what actually happened in the testing, and also checking out the repository, all that happens in Bootstrap. And we, one, want to rewrite it in Go, and second, we want to move that outside of the container so that the container can assume that when it starts, that all of the repositories it needs are checked out in the right location, and then it can just run its scenario, and then exit 0 or 1 depending on whether or not testing passed or failed. Optionally copying some debugging artifacts into another location, and then that there's some other, and then all of the artifacts and get copied up magically, so that so that the fact that the container is part of Prow and TestGrid and Kubernetes is something that the container itself doesn't have to understand. And I think it might be, yeah, so there's the proposal out there, and I think Steve says that Red Hat is already doing a lot of this, which sounds pretty awesome if I put out a design doc and the code already exists. But yeah, so happy to discuss that, or I'd be really interested in hearing from Steve what you guys are doing and how we can, how much of that we can take and how little code I actually have to write.
Right. So right now, there's a couple key differences between the way that Prow is moving forward with spawning pods. I think we don't have any jobs that correlate one-to-one job to pod. Pretty much always the jobs that we're writing today, we use container images as checkpoints in the middle. So we'll do a container image that clones all the source, and we'll commit that. And then we'll do a container image that builds artifacts, and we'll commit that. And then our test jobs start with those container images and run forward. But in general, every test pod that we run, it does have an init container that will write down the config that was used to start it. So these are all the Prow injected variables. And then the container itself is running a entry point script that's written in Go. And what that script does is it runs whatever, and then it redirects standard out and standard error into a file. And it redirects, once it's finished, it'll write the exit code of that command into a different file. We have a sidecar container that's running with that. And what that does, also written in Go, is it knows about an artifact directory, and whenever things pop up in there, it shoves them into GCS. And when it sees the return code file written, it'll take the file that has standard out and standard error and push that as the build log up to GCS as well. A lot of that potentially could be useful to you guys, but I think, and I made a comment as well on the proposal. One of the things that we've been thinking about recently too is sort of like pushing, how do I put this? One of the things that we noticed with a really complicated testing system with a bunch of containers is it's a real like a nightmare just to like figure out what went wrong when something goes wrong. And so putting the onus on pods and init containers to push stuff up into GCS, especially with the way that Kubernetes currently handles like a missing started.json or something, is kind of hairy. So we tried to think about, we have a pod that is watching Prow jobs, and as they get created and Jenkins jobs get started for them, we can actually push started and finish.json up then from there, because the test doesn't necessarily, like, there's some fields that get like dynamically computed during the test, but the vast majority of them that we're actually interested in are just like what configuration went into there, when did I think I started it, when did it finish. But yeah, I definitely think that like having an interface where somebody provides to you, and so again, in our case, it's actually just our contract is your working directory is your repository. You give us the commands to run. It's not give me a pod spec, but something of the sort, definitely really valuable. And if we don't, the only reason we don't use a pod spec and we use just the command is so that we can do that streaming of standard out and standard error into a file. And the reason we did that was to hopefully in the future support streaming that log out to something. But if we aren't supporting that today, just having the sidecar around would probably be enough. And I can link. I'll shoot a link to the tool in the chat, and we're very happy to upstream it.
Yeah, this I think this might be worth continuing to discuss or to figure out how do we want. My thinking, the reason why I was doing this all with I think your idea about having parts of maybe have the started and finished be responsible, have some other pod doing that sounds fine. The thinking, I guess ideally I would like to not have any constraints on the image. Like you basically don't need to change your image at all to make it work with Prow. You just sort of have Prow run it, and then everything just works. And I'm not sure how necessary that is, but it sort of seems potentially, useful to me. But yeah.
One question I had for you guys, because I don't know what you run with in production. For our production clusters, we ubiquitously use Journal D as the logging driver, which has rate limits built into it so that it doesn't blow up the system logging storage. So we noticed that and so there's also the issue that for Docker, all of the logs from every container go through the daemon. So if you have really high throughput nodes with a bunch of tests running, sometimes that gets rate limited and you lose test output. So we needed to do, we control the entry point so that we can throw standard out and standard error into a file on a shared volume. And then that can get put into GCS and we know we never miss anything. But if you guys aren't running with a lossy storage driver, then that's not a consideration.
I don't think so. I don't, like all the clusters that are stood up with the wonderful cluster shell script thing.
JSON file is fine. I know that isn't lossy.
Yeah. They all log directly to file and bypass Journal D as far as I know.
Okay, I didn't know what your guys' GKE ones look like.
I'm sure it's whatever the default is for GKE. And it's, yeah, I'm not, to be honest, I don't know what that default is, but I don't think we've customized that. But I mean, it does, I actually do think, if you check in the cloud storage console, it like outputs standard out to our logging, like you can view the logs there. But I think that we haven't had problems with it thus far. So, but yeah, that's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, we were having, back in the early days, Samsung was trying to scale test a 1,000 node cluster, and we found some fun log level v4 messages that choked up Journal D pretty hard. It was impressive. And we spent a long time scratching our heads like why nobody else had seen this if Google was scale testing it, and it turns out they weren't using Journal D at all. So it was actually, all right, technically it was like glog was writing unbuffered to standard error. And so as soon as systemd's buffer filled up, it blocked, which blocked the scheduler, and the scheduler didn't schedule anything else. It was all kinds of fun.
Don't mention it to Eric Paris or he'll go into a cold sweat. But yeah, Eric, I'm definitely happy to keep in touch and work with you on this one.
Would you be willing to, maybe we could throw together another one of those breakout sessions later this week for us to talk in more detail?
Yeah, and I could try to demo one of our pipelines running.
Yeah, sounds great.
Let's do that.
Cool. And so, I mean, I think that's, but I guess the only other thing would be if anybody, has comments, please add them. So, and some people have already done that. So thank you for that. And yeah, hopefully we can get alignment on a direction and then go pull that in or implement it, et cetera, in the near future.
All right, cool. And we are at 30 minutes. Thanks everybody for your time today, and look forward to seeing you all next week. Happy Tuesday.